By the late 1980s, Nintendo was at the top of the gaming world. The NES had resurrected the industry and competitors had all but disappeared. But in 1989, a new challenger entered the ring, one that would ignite the greatest rivalry in gaming history. This is the story of the console wars, Nintendo versus Sega. For years, Nintendo ruled the video game industry without competition, but all that was about to change. A bold, aggressive company, also from Japan, was about to shake up the gaming world, and the battle for the living room was about to begin. Sega had been around since the 1960s, making arcade machines and dabbling in the console market. Their 8-bit Master System was a solid machine, but against Nintendo's juggernaut NES, it barely made a dent. But Sega wasn't done. They had one last shot, and this time, they were going all in. In 1989, Sega launched the Genesis in North America, with better graphics, better sound, and a powerful 16-bit processor. It was a generational leap beyond the NES, but the real battle was about to start, because Sega wasn't just fighting with technology, they were about to change the rules of marketing. Sega's secret weapon wasn't just hardware, it was attitude. Instead of playing it safe like Nintendo, Sega went for a bold, in-your-face marketing strategy aimed directly at teenagers, and it all started with one phrase: Genesis does what Nintendo don't. Nintendo was the establishment, the family-friendly company. Sega, they were the rebels, the cool alternative. But Sega still had one problem. Nintendo had Mario, and they needed a mascot of their own. Enter Sonic the Hedgehog. Designed to be faster, cooler, and edgier than Mario, Sonic was Sega's answer to Nintendo's mascot dominance. And in 1991, Sonic the Hedgehog launched on the Genesis and changed the game forever. With Sonic, Sega finally had what they needed: an identity. The Genesis wasn't just another console, it was a statement. It was cool, it was fast, it was anti-Nintendo. And it worked. By 1992, the Genesis had taken a shocking 55% of the US market, something no other company had ever done. For the first time, Nintendo was losing. Nintendo wasn't about to let Sega take over. In 1991, they launched their own 16-bit machine, the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, SNES. With Super Mario World leading the charge, Nintendo was back in the fight. But this time, Nintendo was facing an opponent unlike any before. The console war wasn't just about games anymore. It was a full-blown cultural battle. By 1994, the rivalry had reached its peak. Sega had Mortal Kombat with blood. Nintendo had a censored version. Nintendo had Donkey Kong Country. Sega had Sonic and Knuckles. The war was so fierce that even US Congress got involved, debating violence in video games. In the end, Nintendo regained its throne, outselling the Genesis worldwide. But Sega had changed the industry forever. They proved that Nintendo wasn't untouchable, and that gaming could be more than just a kid's pastime. And soon, a new challenger would enter the ring, one that would change the gaming world forever. The year is 1994. The The console war between Nintendo and Sega has dominated the gaming world for years, but a new challenger is about to enter the ring. A company with no gaming experience, a company that had once been partners with Nintendo. That company was Sony. What followed was one of the most dramatic power shifts in gaming history, the rise of PlayStation and the fall of Sega. For over a decade, Nintendo and Sega had fought for control of the video game industry, but neither of them expected what was coming next. A former ally of Nintendo, Sony, was about to change gaming forever, and in the process, Sega would make the biggest mistakes in gaming history. The story of PlayStation doesn't start in 1994. It starts in 1988, when Sony and Nintendo were supposed to be partners. At the time, Nintendo wanted to create a CD-based add-on for the SNES, and they turned to Sony to make it happen. The two companies worked together for years, and by 1991, Sony was ready to announce their creation, the Super Nintendo PlayStation. But then, at the very last minute, Nintendo betrayed Sony. Behind Sony's back, they had secretly struck a new deal with Philips, canceling their partnership with Sony overnight. Sony was humiliated, but rather than leaving gaming forever, they decided to do something unthinkable. They turned their scrapped project into a brand new console. That console? The Sony PlayStation. Nobody took Sony seriously. After all, they were an electronics company, not a game company. But when the PlayStation launched in Japan in December 1994, everything changed. Sony had one goal: to make gaming cool for adults and teenagers, not just kids. And to do that, they had to take down both Sega and Nintendo. While Sony was preparing the PlayStation, Sega was making a critical mistake. Their next console, the Sega Saturn, was rushed to market, and it would cost them everything. Sega's mistake wasn't just rushing the console, it was how they launched it. At E3 1995, Sega shocked the world by announcing that the Sega Saturn was available immediately, catching even game developers off guard. Retailers and developers were furious. The Saturn was expensive, $399, hard to develop for, and lacked must-have games. And then, Sony delivered the death blow. Sony had undercut Sega by $100, making the PlayStation the clear choice. Within months, the Saturn was already failing. And then, in 1996, PlayStation delivered its knockout punch, a game that would change everything. That game was Final Fantasy VII. By 1997, PlayStation was unstoppable. With Final Fantasy VII, Metal Gear Solid, Gran Turismo, and Resident Evil, Sony had become the new king of gaming. Meanwhile, Sega was in free fall. In 1999, they released one final console, the Sega Dreamcast, but it was too little, too late. By 2001, Sega was finished in the console market. Sony had won. Nintendo had survived. But Sega? They were forced to quit the hardware business forever. Sony had changed the industry. They made gaming cool, pushed the medium into 3D cinematic experiences, and set the stage for the future. But soon, a new competitor would rise, one that nobody saw coming. The year was 2001, and Microsoft was about to enter the war.